So I'll talk today about globally networked risks and how to respond by means of computational social science and global system science. There's no doubt the problems of the world are complex. We're confronted with financial crisis, with conflicts and war, with climate change and many other problems. And apparently we haven't solved them, so we need to do better. We need to have a new approach, and that's why some folks have actually proposed to come up with a global systems science. That means a systems science for global systems. And that basically requires to integrate different kinds of disciplines and a global effort and a grand integration of knowledge. Now, one of the problems that people are thinking about in this connection is, of course, the micro-macro problem. How does the behavior of our economy, of our society, of the world result from individual actions? And of course, there's more and more information about how individuals behave. Still, we don't always understand so well what happens out there in the real world. And so the question is, what are the issues over here? Apparently, representative agent models are not always doing the job they should be doing, and co-evolution and correlations and all these kind of things are more important than maybe we thought some time ago to understand maybe the most interesting phenomena out there in our economic and social world. Opinion formation is among these phenomena. Apparently people are influenced by other people. That creates a tendency towards convergence, towards consensus formation, but still there is a high diversity of opinions out there. And this is difficult to understand. For many opinion formation models, such as these bounded confidence models, for example, in order to keep up some diversity in the outcomes of these computer simulations that they do, they assume that people are not influenced by those people who have opinions that are more different than a certain epsilon. And then, of course, you sustain different opinions, but if you add a little bit of noise, then basically this goes away and you find convergence again. If you add too much noise, then you find this chaotic or random situation, as you can see it over here. So the question is really, how can we understand it? And apparently there is a competition between this convergence and, on the other hand, a force that's directed towards individualization. That means to be different from others, if many people agree. And that creates basically this splitting up of opinion clusters, as we know it also from the political landscape. You know, sometimes political parties divide themselves, split up. The same thing with religious movements, and sometimes there is this fusion, and this is what we see in reality. That's work that has been done with Michael Mason and Andreas Flache. I'm getting more and more concerned, though, about coming up with models about opinion formation and other human behaviors, because the question is in the room, could that knowledge be misused by some powers to influence the future of societies, and not necessarily in the best way? You know, could revolutions be triggered? Could wars be triggered? And other things that people would not like to see, usually. So how do we go about this ethical problem? So I'm less and less willing to share my knowledge about these kinds of dynamics. But let's talk about the good side. At least in many cases we consider coordination and cooperation something which is desirable. In particular, this is needed to address issues such as environmental exploitation or environmental pollution or overfishing and other tragedies of the commons. And so the question is, how can we gain the understanding that would allow us to address these problems? evolutionary games theory is one of these approaches. I'm starting off with a coordination problem, because that's simpler to understand. So suppose we have two pedestrians and they have to walk around each other because they're walking into opposite directions. Then they have basically two options, to go left or right. And there are two pedestrians that defines as a payoff matrix. So if both go to the right, then apparently they manage to evade each other. So they have been successful, and that creates a positive benefit B. If one goes to the right and the other one goes to the left, then they're still standing in front of each other. They haven't succeeded, and the payoff is 0. So this payoff matrix is known from coordination games, and plug it in to an equation that describes the change of the collective behavior with time, so-called replicator equation. And if you do that, then you eventually end up with this equation over here. Now, a mathematician or a physicist would basically look for the stationary solutions, and there are 3 of them: a 50-50 situation, or everyone going to the right, or everyone going to the left. The 50-50 situation seems to be the most natural solution, actually. Why should people have a preference for one side? It turns out, however, if you make an analysis of the stability of the stationary solutions, that the 50-50 situation is actually an unstable stationary point. And as a result, any small deviation from that solution will drive the system away from 50-50 towards either p equals 1 or p equals 0, which means that everyone will end up doing the same thing. That means behavioral convention is born, and this is what we find, right? Peyton Young has also worked on this. Actually, I got interested in this during my diploma thesis. And of course, then the question comes up, what happens for other kinds of payoff matrices? And a lot of scientists have worked on various games, in particular the Prisoner's Dilemma game, which got a lot of attention because it's a social dilemma situation where cooperation would be favorable for everyone. But in the end, everyone ends up not cooperating. That means defecting. And why is this? Well, if both people cooperate, they would get a reward R, much higher than the payoff when they don't cooperate, called punishment. But if I cooperate and you don't, you will get a much higher payoff than R, called temptation. And I will end up with the sucker's payoff over here, lower than P. That means cooperation is risky and defection is tempting. And that destabilizes the desirable solution, which is cooperation. And of course, if I've been exploited, I wouldn't go on cooperating, and we would end up in this unfortunate tragedy of the commons, where both people don't cooperate. And of course, in many experimental situations, you find that, in particular in iterated games. So the question is, how can we avoid such defection? How can we reach cooperation? And then let's look at the impact of globalization, for example. So for the sake of simplicity, we have assumed over here that people interact with their neighbors in a circle, right? And neighborhood interactions are actually known to be potentially favorable for cooperation in social dilemma situations, because clusters of cooperation can be sustained. And then the question, what happens if we add some random additional links in the system, more and more and more and more, to simulate globalization in an oversimplified way, right? Then it turns out in the beginning, actually, the level of cooperation goes up, and that's fine. So we would say, okay, let's go on networking with each other, let's go on globalizing the world, and you have even more cooperation, and so on, until you can reach this point over there. And then any additional linking between people would create a hyper-connected world where actually cooperation goes down, 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 down. And finally, if everyone cooperates with everyone else, or everyone interacts with randomly chosen individuals, then we know what happens, because that's what the replicator equation predicts, and it's defection, right? Unfortunately, this fact is not known by many decision makers who have global impact, and so we have gone on networking the world. And in fact, Andy Haldane from the Bank of England has pointed out that in the banking network we have seen an increasing degree of connectivity, and he assumes that that was one of the contributing factors to the financial crisis in 2007-8 and following years. So we need to pay more attention to these kind of things, and in fact this interdependency also creates bankruptcy cascades as we've seen them after Lehman Brothers went bust. So as you can see over here, over a few years, hundreds of banks went bankrupt, and that created losses of hundreds of billions of dollars. Of course, a system shouldn't be designed that way. We shouldn't be seeing these terrible cascading effects that are so costly to our system, so destructive. And in fact, here is a simplified model of what we're seeing over here. Yeah, a system of table tennis balls on mouse traps, and you can see a single local perturbation, like this bankruptcy of Lehman Brothers. You know, it can mess up the entire system, and the entire system could be our entire globe, because now we have global systems in almost every single sector, and that is really concerning. And in fact, we are seeing that also during flash crashes. So, you know, within 20 minutes, you can lose $600 billion. Yeah, that was on a Friday afternoon. Suppose that would have been 3 hours later, that could have been the end. So basically, we need to come up with better designed and better managed systems that consider the dangers that come with networking, not just the benefits. And basically, we need to have engineered breaking points to stop cascades. And for some systems, we know pretty well how these breaking points have to look like for electrical power grids. And so the question is really, how would we create these breaking points in the financial system and other systems too? I mean, international conflict is just one other example, in fact. Right? Yeah, so this brings us to social mechanism design, because it turns out that by changing the interactions, we can actually create different kinds of outcomes, because many of the macroscopic outcomes in complex dynamical systems, such as our economy and our society, result from the kinds of interactions in the system. And if we choose different kinds of interactions, we could get a different outcome. In many cases, we can determine the emergent outcome by choosing the interactions. Well, in fact, since hundreds, if not thousands of years, people are inventing social mechanisms and institutions. One of them is called pull punishment, or police, and may come with surveillance, and certainly a mechanism that has become more and more important recently in response to this global destabilization that we've seen. But unfortunately, the reason for this destabilization has not been well understood, so the question is whether that is the right kind of response to stabilize the world. And in fact, there are some doubts about it. As we've seen in Ferguson, actually, having these tanks hasn't increased social order. On the contrary, it has just created social unrest instead. And we've seen similar things now with increase of terrorism. So we really need to rethink our strategies, how to create social order in a globalized and multicultural world. And I'll come back to this later on because I think we actually need different kinds of mechanisms. And I will explain why. We're coming back to surveillance. I should say that many bad things that we don't want to happen cannot be prevented by surveillance. We can see bad things happen, like this traffic jam, phantom traffic jam that happens here, although no driver really wants it to happen. And even if we could look into the heads of all these people and knew every single thought, we couldn't prevent this from happening. Why can I claim this? Well, basically because there are mathematical models that allow us to understand perfectly the occurrence of these phantom traffic jams. And it's a result of too high density. So then basically what happens, a small variation in the speed will be amplified. And that creates a cascading effect. And in the end, cars get stopped, although nobody wants this to happen. And similar things happen in other unstable systems. So the issue is really to avoid instability in complex dynamical systems. If you don't want systems to get out of control, but surveillance won't help necessarily. This is an experiment that we did in our labs. What we were trying to understand is what people were choosing to do in a situation where they were again distributed in a ring and interacting with close by neighbors. People had different preferences, and we wanted to predict what they were doing, right? So this is a deterministic model, and as you can see, the prediction of this deterministic model is not so well compatible with the typical experimental session, right? Nevertheless, what we find is that the deterministic model predicts about 96% of all decisions correctly. 96%. I think in social science you have never seen a micromodel that is so accurate. So how can it be that such an accurate micromodel doesn't predict the macro outcome correctly? That's kind of puzzling, right? So the crystal ball doesn't work, and the reason is that this again is an unstable system. In this case, two small deviations would cause a cascade that would trigger a completely different kind of outcome. Now, consider the following thing. What we've then done is we have added some noise to this deterministic and almost perfect model. So we made it less accurate in terms of predicting individual decisions. But it was much better in predicting macro outcomes. Why? Because it was considering the possibility of deviations and their impact on the system. So basically we really have to rethink how we go about modeling of systems and their prediction and their management. This super surveillance system that has been built in the world is not the right kind of approach to help us solve all these instability problems that we're confronted with. In fact, the unsolved problems that we have in our world are all characterized by systemic instability. So we really need to understand this point and how to change that instability. Well, in fact, since thousands of years, people have been thinking about these problems and came up with solutions. And one of these solutions was kin selection or genetic favoritism, right? In Europe too, we had dynasties that were pretty powerful, and it worked for quite some time. But it had side effects. Side effects were blood revenge, ethnic conflict, these kind of things, and we still see this kind of conflict happen in those areas of the world where social systems are still based on this. So eventually people came up with other mechanisms, such as direct reciprocity. They were living in villages and cities, they met again, they interacted frequently. It paid off to be friends with each other, and that to some extent replaced genetic favoritism. But it came again with some side effects, and this side effect is called corruption. And too much friendship is not good because your economic system wouldn't be transparent for newcomers. And so we keep thinking about alternative mechanisms that would be successful in terms of establishing cooperation, but would minimize side effects. Right? So the issue is really to transform the prisoner's dilemma into something else by means of biological, social, or economic mechanisms. And among them, kin selection, direct reciprocity, indirect reciprocity, costly peer punishment, or altruistic punishment, however you like to call it, network interactions, and others. And as you can see, these mechanisms transform the prisoner's dilemma in different ways into different kinds of games. Stake hunt games, harmony games, snowdrift games. In the case of harmony game, everyone would cooperate naturally. In the case of the snowdrift game, there would be a coexistence of cooperation and defection. In the case of stake hunt, you need to push the level of cooperation beyond a certain threshold, and then more and more people would cooperate. Well, one mechanism that is interesting in a globalized and heterogeneous world is reputation. And I think that's one of the reasons why reputation mechanisms have spread so quickly on the web. And I do think that these mechanisms need to be further improved, in particular to take into account multiple criteria. One-dimensional reputation systems are too restrictive and cause side effects that we don't want to have. Other mechanisms are merit-based matching, and Heinrich certainly will explain you in much more detail how this works. This is really fascinating because by matching people who are more cooperative with each other, this is not just good for cooperators because they would be less exploited. It's also good for the system because it creates a trend towards more cooperation, right? And this is what we want to have. Moreover, there are other kinds of experiments, again with Michael Mays, that show that competition would be able to increase cooperation and also costly signaling. So there are all sorts of mechanisms that we are not always using to the extent we should be using them to solve the problems we are confronted with. And here is another interesting game. Again, a social dilemma game, but this time we're looking into a strategy set which is a little bit bigger. So besides defectors, free riders, and cooperators, we would have moralists and immoralists. Forget about the immoralists for a moment. Moralists are cooperators that punish defectors at a cost. It's costly punishment. And blue are the cooperators who don't punish. I mean, they're second-order free riders in a sense. So what would happen if these three strategies interact with each other in a social dilemma setting, and there's no spatial structure, so everyone either interacts with everyone else or they interact with randomly chosen interaction partners? Well, we know this. Basically, moralists would be crowded out because they're paying this cost for punishment. So cooperators are doing better because they save the punishment cost. Cooperators are crowding out the moralists, and then what we have is, in the end, a competition between cooperators and defectors. And we know how that ends. Cooperators will be exploited by defectors and will end up with the tragedy of the commons. Now, let's look at exactly the same game, just played in a spatial setting. where people interact just with their neighbors and copy the best performing neighbor's strategy, imitation, right? And it turns out that we just get the opposite outcome. That means the representative agent model, which would be the replicator equation for that kind of problem, predicts completely the wrong outcome. And that is so surprising. You know, in the beginning, it looks like we would end up with defection. Yeah, so defectors are spreading, and newspapers would write, "This will be the end of the world. You know, nobody will cooperate anymore." But you know, after some time, we see actually blue and green are taking over. And we see another thing, namely a clustering of these strategies. You know, birds of a feather flock together, right? Because of this imitation dynamics. And interestingly enough, that separates the cooperators from the moralists, and in between we find those defectors. So what happens is, the moralists don't have to compete with the cooperators directly anymore, because they're separated. And instead, we have a situation where defectors and cooperators compete, and of course, that will be bad for the cooperators. So the defectors would spread in that competition. But the moralists can punish the defectors, right? So in the competition between those two, the moralists thrive and spread. So the existence of the defectors allow the moralists to survive and spread because of the spatial clustering, and so we have a co-evolution between behavior and spatial organization. And that is so surprising that Herb Gintis didn't believe it in the beginning, and when we had a workshop, a summer school in southern Italy, he was sitting down in the evenings and reprogramming this on his own computer until he found that this was really true. You know? So this is kind of surprising, and you find other surprising things in the same game. So have a look at that paper. And another surprising thing is actually what happens if you add success-driven migration to this imitation of the best performing neighbor. So that means that within a certain radius around you, people would look for better places where they expect more cooperative neighbors and hope that they would stay cooperative. Now, to make it a little bit more thrilling, we have added two kinds of noise. One noise actually is flipping the strategy. So that means we say 5% probability people will do just the opposite of copy the best performing neighbor strategy, right? And as you can see over here, this noise is highly destructive. So while we start with cooperation, we end up with a lot of defection, right? No success-driven migration yet. Yeah? Here we have a kind of migration which is just random. So with a certain probability, people would relocate to a random place. And as you can see over here, this is also highly destructive for social order. Yeah, not only the cluster disappears, also cooperation disappears. So the question is, what will happen if you combine imitation of the best performing neighbor strategies and these two absolutely destructive noises and success-driven migration to basically try to find nice neighbors. And I told my PhD student, Benjamin Yu, at that time, can you do the simulation and please start with defection only to make it more exciting. And I came back 2 weeks later and asked him, have you done the simulation? And he said, no. I asked, why didn't you do the simulation? Well, because it doesn't make any sense. You will not find anything interesting. You know, they will stay defecting all the time. And this is kind of Thomas Hobbes' world, you know, like everyone is a wolf to everyone else. Homo hominis lupus, yeah? So I told him do it, and I came back 2 weeks later, and still he didn't do it. So I said, okay, now I want you to do this right now. And what happened is he was right for 5 minutes. And then see what happened. And that was kind of surprising. That's why it was published in PNAS. So everyone starts defecting. The bad world. And then because of migratory dynamics, people spread out in the entire world. And then after 25,000 iterations, by coincidence, we find a small cooperative cluster over there. Yeah? And it turns out that there's a nucleation effect. That means as soon as we have such cooperative cluster, cooperation spreads throughout the system very quickly. And that's why we call it an outbreak of cooperation. So it takes a long time, but once it starts to spread, it will be spreading very quickly. And that's kind of surprising. And so people like Ernst Fehr said, that's interesting, but I'm not sure this is really relevant for the real world. And so we started to do experiments in the lab with team members of Ernst Fehr, Charles Effelson and Sonja Vogt, and they were not believing that we would find anything like this formation of cooperative clusters. So that's the kind of situation. To make it more difficult, people did not even know whether their neighbors cooperated or not. They could just decide to either play again the same strategy as they did before, or move to another location. And what we found is, very surprisingly, mobility is key to success. It increases cooperation and payoff. It allows cooperation to thrive, and those who cooperate actually are better off. That's kind of surprising, and I'd like to also point you to some work that I've done back in 2002, approximately. I've just uploaded that draft because it was published as a different paper with a different title, and but as we are talking today more and more about scarce resources and how to distribute them, I was uploading this draft now to SSRN, so it will be there in a few days. And what we did there was basically an experiment about a route choice problem. In this case, the scarce resource is space, right? There is a freeway and there is a small road, and people have to decide which road to take. And of course, everyone would like to take the freeway because that's faster, but if everyone does that, there will be congestion, right? So they have to distribute over these two roads in order to create a systemic benefit, but then those who go on the small road would have a longer travel time. So they create benefits for those who are on the freeway. So it's a social dilemma situation. And the question is, how would you get the systemic optimum? And we did experiments in which we were giving them information about the traffic situation that resulted the day before. And we gave them information in different ways, and we also had setups where we recommended them a route. And the recommendation was taking into account the percentage of people who were following the recommendation. So that percentage was measured. And it turns out that people are doing pretty well over there. And so what's possible here is to come up with a recommender system that would work very different from the classical congestion charge, or just punish people for using a car. Instead, what we have over here is everyone will get a recommendation. Recommendations are made in a fair way. That means on some days we'll have a recommendation to use the freeway, on other days we'll have a recommendation to use the small road in such a way that a systemic optimum would result. Now it could happen, of course, that just on that day where you are supposed to use the small road, which creates a longer travel time for you, you're in a hurry. You know, you got up late or have a very important appointment. So what you can do is you can pay some money to somebody else on who had the recommendation to use the freeway, for him to change to the small road to make space for him on the freeway. So that means there's flexibility. I could use the freeway even though I was recommended to use the other road, but I have to pay for this. I have to find somebody who would instead, for me, go on the small road, so the systemic optimum is still sustained. And as long as people don't do that always, on average, you wouldn't have to pay a price. Yeah? As long as you're fair, you don't have to pay anything. Only if you think, okay, I'm a manager and I never have time and I always have to use the freeway, then you would have to pay many of the days. But somebody else, somebody who has a lot of time, could make money on this, right? And I'd like to propose to look more into these kinds of information and recommender systems that leave freedoms, that inform people and help them to coordinate with each other. Well, there are other interesting things that I'd like to raise, which is people are not as selfish as we've often thought, and of course experiments have shown that for quite a few decades in the meantime. But it has really fundamentally questioned this original idea of the selfish decision maker, Homo economicus. And so I was always skeptical about this idea that in the end friendly people would be eliminated by biological evolution, and that's why we should all be selfish sooner or later. Yeah? And which is the basis of our economic thinking and systems and institutions. So one day I said, let's do that evolutionary simulation and see what comes out. So here are the assumptions. So we assume that people would optimize their choices based on a best response rule, as economists would assume it. No imitation here. Yeah. So we're not thinking as a sociologist here, we're thinking as an economist. Optimization, right? And they interact with their neighbors, and they have a certain utility function. In this utility function, it's possible to consider the payoff of the interaction partners and give that payoff a certain weight in the own utility function. Yeah, you could say, okay, why would people do that? Well, we don't know. Just assume it would be a possibility. Yeah? But in the beginning, we set these weights to 0. That means the friendliness, the consideration of other people's payoff is set to 0. So we assume everyone is born as an egoist, yeah? As a Homo economicus. Then biology steps in. So friendliness is inherited genetically or by education to offspring, children. And the likelihood to have offspring, however, exclusively depends on the own payoff. That means not on the utility function, right? So you really have to make money to be able to afford to have children and feed them. Yeah? Friendliness doesn't help you there. So payoff matters here, and if somebody is friendly but exploited by everyone else, then that person will have no payoff and therefore no children. That's the brutal assumption here. Yeah? And then, however, there is a certain mutation rate, that's again biology. So offspring tend to have a similar friendliness or similar weight, but a little bit different. And we have made this mutation assumption in a way that it wouldn't create a genetic drift towards being friendly. That's important because otherwise it's not interesting. Yeah? So basically, the expected friendliness based on that mutation mechanism is 0.2. What we'll find later is a much higher average friendliness. So if you look into these 4 assumptions, then none of these assumptions would allow you to understand other regarded preferences of high levels of friendliness among people, right? It turns out, however, that there are interaction effects, again, between these different rules. Yeah? A co-evolutionary mechanism steps in, and it results in a situation where, yes, for most parameter combinations, in fact, a Homo economicus, who is selfish, results, as economists have always assumed, right? But what's that? There is a small corner where actually people would end up having other regarding preferences. So they have some level of friendliness over there. And we call this Homosuch Alice. When is this happening? Well, that is happening when children are raised close to their parents. And this is actually what humans are doing. And they're the only species who are raising their children for almost 20 years. You know, this is exceptional, right? So it must have a meaning. So, as a result, we can say, surprisingly, evolution has made many of us other regarding. And that's probably the reason why we're doing better than other species. So the point here is, it takes many generations. But then suddenly we have this outbreak of friendliness and cooperation, while cooperation in the beginning is costly, painful, you could even say. In the end, actually, it's beneficial. So other regarding preferences allow people to overcome the tragedy of the commons, and that's why they earn more, right? Now, Homosuch Alice is not stupid. He's conditionally cooperative, takes self-determined but other regarding decisions. So decides differently from Homo economicus, and we could say they put themselves into the shoes of others by considering the pain of others to some extent, and that's why they decide like network minds. This is the outcome. In the beginning, nobody is friendly, but eventually, over many generations, we have a broad distribution of friendliness values, much higher than 0.2 actually on average. And that means we have individual utility functions in the end, something that we actually observe in reality, right? And these simulation results are pretty much consistent with what people find, like Ryan Murphy and his team, in experiments. Well, there are some individualistic, selfish people, Homo economicus, but actually the majority of people seem to have some level of pro-sociality, some friendliness, some other regardedness. And actually even Adam Smith knew that, as this quote shows over there. So if we look into this and simulate 2 populations, we can actually see not only the evolution of cooperation and other regarding preferences, but also the cooperation between strangers. Again, it takes time. It takes a long time. But altogether, I'd like to say economics for a long time has focused on Homo economicus as one of the solutions of this evolutionary game that I showed you before, but there is a second solution, right? And it's not just a small deviation of Homo economicus, it's something different. And I think we should be having an economic theory for this species, the other regarding human. And we need to come up, I believe, with institutions that would be made for them. So I further like to point out that in the case of Homo economicus, assumptions of statistical independent decision making may often be good enough. On the other hand, if people decide in another regarding way, a la network minds, that means there's always an interdependency on what other people do, and that creates a complex dynamics and new complexity. Science would be needed to understand that kind of behavior. So basically what I'm saying is we need to have a second economic theory which is actually made for this Homosuch Alice, and I'd like to point out that we need to make much more effort to build this theory. Now we've also seen that people end up having different preferences and utility functions. So people are unequal. They would have incompatible preferences, as this experiment with Fabian Winter and Heiko Rauhut shows. So some have equity preferences, for example, others have equality preferences, and that creates conflict if these kind of people meet each other. And then the question is, what results as people interact in a society when there is this heterogeneity? And there can be different outcomes. So either everyone does what they like a laissez-faire society, or one behavior sets the norm and everyone ends up doing the same thing, and that very much depends on the payoff structure, of course. And we find these different things in our labs, and as we look into multi-population games, then in fact there can be many different outcomes, highly interesting outcomes, all of which we actually find in our society. But many of them can be understood with surprisingly simple mathematics, including conflicts and revolutions. And actually there was another part of our activity in the past years, in particular together with Karsten Donai. We've been looking into conflict in the Middle East, and it turns out that cultural distance is the main determinant of the dynamics that we find. And basically, as a result, there are three possible solutions. One is segregation, another one is war, and the third one is tolerance. And it's possible to look now into different kind of scenarios, because now we can come up with agent-based models that are evidence-based, that are calibrated to data. And therefore, we can now advise in a model-based way about the potential implications of the different kinds of political scenarios, such as the Clinton plan or the Palestinian proposal and others. So with this, I'd like to end. I'd like to thank very much for your interest, and I'm looking forward to the debate.